Okay, thank you. And again, welcome. Really excited about this evening because it's such a relevant topic we're going to be discussing about the importance of mental health. So before we get into the conversation, welcome Dr. Chetna Kang. I'm going to read out a bit of a bio. So it's just going to be straight off here. Chetna recently published in the BBC's very first Thought for the Day book in 50 years. Dr. Chetna Kang is a consultant psychiatrist, broadcaster, and a Bhakti yoga practitioner. Well known for her spiritual commentary on mental health and current affairs, she presents Thought for the Day on Radio 4's Today program and features on Beyond Belief. She also conceived of and co-hosted Shrink Wrapped for 3 years, which is the BBC's only weekly live mental health program. Graduating from Imperial College as a medical doctor and then specializing in psychiatry, she brings together over 2 decades of experience in scientific advances in mental health with integrative models of care. Dr. Kang is on the executive committee for the Royal College of Psychiatrists' Spiritual and Psychiatry Special Interest Group and was finalist for the Royal College's Public Educator of the Year award for 2 consecutive years. She runs mental health workshops for many large international organizations such as Goldman Sachs, Ernst & Young, Accenture, JP Morgan and Barclays, and is frequently featured in print and digital media, on TV, and regularly published in books and journals. Okay, hope you all caught that. Clearly we have an expert with us, which is helpful because we're going to get into some of the detail of what is obviously a very live and complex topic. So before I get into the questions, from an Avanti perspective, as in why is this important to us in terms of this conversation, I wanted just to set the scene for everyone in terms of some key facts that's come up through recent research, just to set the scene in terms of how important it is that we have this conversation. So there was an NHS, there have been a couple of NHS studies on this, and I'm just going to give you some of the highlights from that and also a couple from Young Minds and from the World Health Organization. So this is, I'm referring to the 2022 5-year study, close to about 3,000 young people, age 6 and above. And they're looking at mental health from the lens of emotional, behavioral, and relationships. So that's their context of what they're looking at. So here are some headlines. 1 in 4, okay, so 1 in 4 of 17 to 19-year-olds have probable mental disorder. And this is up from 1 in 6 in 2021. And so the ages 7 to 16, so you can see there's a massive increase in the 17 to 19-year-olds. And then from ages 7 to 16, the rate has stayed relatively flat over that same time period. But that flat is still very high. It's 1 in 5. So in a classroom context, you're looking at, 5 to 6 children in a classroom being affected by this. Okay, so, and then what's also interesting is the male-female comparison. So in the younger ages, 7 to 16, it's higher in males, almost double. And then it flips. So between 17 and 24, the female rate goes to 1.5 times the male rate. So that's an interesting dynamic. So there's a dynamic about what's different in 7 to 19 versus up to 16. And then there was a separate study by the NHS which showing that under 18s, the number of under 18s in contact with the NHS about mental health services rose by nearly 30% in the last year. So that's close to 1 million children, right, at a point in time. And we know also from other data that there has been a real, I've heard it called an epidemic, which is, seems pretty accurate, in both self-harm. So self-harm, 28% of those who are diagnosed or have a probability of a mental health disorder, 28% of them in the past 4 weeks at the point of asking the question are saying that they've considered self-harm, right? So that's a huge number. And then anorexia, which is another of the kind of, things that we're seeing, 66% of 17 to 24-year-olds, 66%, so 2/3, having a probable eating disorder. And then separate to then in the NHS, and you've got Young Minds talking about suicide rates rising by a third from 2021 to 2022. So that, again, a massive increase. And World Health Organization, recognizing suicide as the fourth leading cause of death, the fourth leading cause of death for 15 to 29-year-olds. So I know that's obviously setting a pretty gloomy picture in terms of what we're faced with here. But I just think it's really important for us to bear this in mind in terms of the context within which young people are growing up. And we're going to get into some of the challenges and some of the possible responses to that. And I think from a school perspective and what we do in schools with regards to personal development and emotional mental support and the kinds of things that we typically refer to. So whether that's things about kind of healthy sleep and exercise and relationships and all of those resilience building kind of problem solving skills, but getting into the detail of what that might look like. So I'm going to kick off, if that's okay, having set the scene in terms of the first question here. So I guess just from a helicopter view, what do you feel are some of the key drivers that might be behind what we're seeing here in the data?
Our modern lifestyles bring with them lots of luxuries, but they've brought a lot of challenges, because I think we've gotten so busy, especially these days where there's so many demands on us to keep up a certain standard of living, to be valued, that many people are really busy working really hard just to keep still. And they're working so hard to keep still, it's left them with little time to actually invest time, resources, and space in building their own internal resilience, investing in important relationships and family life, their health, all the things that we also contribute to others. So our own internal support, our ability to support others is diminishing. And so, mental health crisis is like any other crisis where there's a demand placed on you where it really exceeds your supply. So we've kind of found ourselves in a vicious cycle, because those who do have time and space are not able to utilize it effectively either, because they're also distracted by modernity. And one of the biggest things about modern lifestyle now is digital media. It is not just distracting, it's addictive. And I think that's got a really huge role to play in the current, not just mental health crisis, but I would say it's an epidemic. I agree with you, it's an epidemic, because it's not just local to one particular cultural subgroup or age group. The statistics you read are for young people, but they're no different really to the tragic state in older people, in middle-aged people, and mental health is a big problem. So, but just coming back to young people, I think the key thing, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, is changes really do have to start early, and it has to start with young people, because, aside from those statistics, if we look at adult mental health, 50%, at least 50% of adult mental health problems have already started by the age of 14. But your average child has to wait up to 10 years to actually get help, either because it's not picked up or the help isn't accessible. So we're in this time now where we probably have better treatments and better understanding, and it's less taboo to talk about mental health, but we have less access and less emphasis on prevention. And it's not good enough, really. We need to do something.
Okay, so you've touched on a lot of really important things, and we're going to dive a bit deeper into those sequentially. But before we do that, you touched upon the kind of digital age, right? So, and that's a big topic for schools in terms of how much time, and I think it's true for parents also. There's a constant anxiety about how much time are they spending in front of a screen, and whether that's social media or PlayStation or whatever it might be. But in terms of what we know about the link between digital devices and mental health, there seems to be it seems, at least from a lay perspective, that the jury's still out Is that true, or do you think that actually we have got conclusive evidence on
The
this?
the jury's not still out. There's conclusive evidence. Digital media has a biological impact and psychological. Okay, so on the biological side, the longer you spend on it, there are detrimental effects. And again, we've had a whole talk on this before. Detrimental impact in terms of your physical health, just in terms of sitting posture, eye strain, things like that. Sleep. I know, I've got to do the same. And that's just the highlights in terms of the biological effect. And psychological, again, it's not just the amount of time you spend, but really more importantly, what are you spending your time doing? Because digital media, a lot of it's about social media. Right? So rather than being outside interacting with others, you're doing it on a screen. So just like, I don't know, back in our day, it was important who we were outside with. So who are you online with? What are you doing with those people? And so much of our character formation, our sense of who we are, was determined by who we spent our time with. So same thing with the digital media. So yes, digital media itself inherently has attributes which are not healthy for us. But by understanding it better, not just by limiting the time, but also in terms of what we're doing and who we're doing that with, that can either make or break your mental health and your sense of who you are.
Yeah, I think that the sense of who you are piece, I think that's a really key piece, because there's also the angle of social media in terms of the perspective of how we are engaging with another person. So the whole personal interaction thing. And I think it was interesting, the perspective of the NHS studies are being directed from the perspective of their relationships, and relationships, as we know, and I'm sure we come on to a bit more about being so key in terms of underpinning good mental health, and how those relationships can get, well, confused, distorted, or difficult via a screen versus in person, and the skills that one needs to adapt to that, I suppose. So you're saying two things. One is that the media itself inherently has some biological and psychological effect, but then the specific activity that you're doing on that media clearly will have a...
Yeah, and the use of it, I mean, it's not going to go away. Yeah. We're not going to get less digital. I mean, I'm sure you see it in your school. Everything's had to keep up with the times, right? So understanding it is our next best option. Just a simple example on the psychological and relationship side is our emotions work at a particular rate. Our body works at a particular speed. Okay, even the body moves at a different pace to the mind, right? And feelings and thoughts. Thoughts are lightning speed. Right. And the body isn't, right? That's where we get jet lag, right? Yeah. So you look at emotions and how we communicate on digital media. If I'm having a conversation with you, right, like we're doing now, you are there to hear my pauses, make eye contact, get a feel for what I mean. Mm-hmm. If I send you a WhatsApp message, you might see that message, but you might see it while you're doing it in the middle, while you're doing something else. In my mind, I've sent you the message right now. My mind's I'm expecting a response straight away. I have no context to what else you might be doing, because as human beings, we become very tunnel visioned with what am I doing now? Yeah. And I'm going to assume you're doing exactly the same thing. If I'm free to be on my phone, you must be also. So do you see what I mean? So this in itself causes a problem. And if you're young, you haven't got the maturity to be thinking about, oh, well, I wonder the other person might be doing something else. Yeah. They're not just blanking me. They're not airing. Do you see what I mean? So just simple things like that understanding that digital media works at speed, which is not harmonious with how we work as human beings, and also runs on other assumptions. Even something like that can be very helpful.
Yeah, and there's another layer to this, which is around the potential anonymity in digital devices, which seems to be behind also increasing levels of other aspects of the darker side of what can go on in terms of things like sexual harassment and other things, which then impose a significant burden on somebody's mental health, because then there's a whole raft of stuff that's coming our way in terms of, again, whether it's self-esteem or identity or other aspects of it. So okay.
I mean, I can go down that road, but we won't go.
That's for another session.
That's another session. Okay. But if I can just make one brief comment on that, sexual harassment, etc., is whether it's out on the streets or on digital media, yes, the anonymous side of it makes it more difficult. But just the way we want to be street smart, we want to be social media smart. And there is one other element, which I think is probably more pervasive, is that digital media, I think, really fuels this perception of perfection.
Yeah.
And people feeding into this, creating a perception of perfection. Yeah. And that's where it leaves young people and adults vulnerable to predators.
Yeah. Okay, good. Let's move on to spirituality, because, clearly for us, as you know, spirituality is a core, I would say even a differentiating factor for Avanti in terms of what it is that we're trying to do. And that spirituality in the context of the fact that we have both religious designated faith schools, and we have schools which don't have a religious designation, but have a spiritual ethos. So there's two bits to this. One is around how do you define spirituality? Because we've had this conversation in Avanti in terms of how do we define it, both because when you're dealing in a faith context, it's quite easy to define that with reference to faith. But when you're talking about a non-denominational or a secular or a non-faith context, what does that look like? And that's been a really interesting challenge for us. So one, how do you think about spirituality in terms of defining it? And what do you think about its potential contribution to supporting mental health?
So if we look at spirituality in its, I guess, most generic and universal sense, which is independent of faith or religion, I would say it's that aspect of every individual self, of each of us, that's independent of our roles, our functions, our relationships in society, or even how we're perceived by society, even down to our personality. Because personality is a perception of other people. It's how other people experience us, right? So at its most basic level, I would say it's at the very least this experience that everybody has of a witness consciousness, that everything around me changes, guaranteed. Everything within me also changes, whether it's my likes and dislikes on my body. But there is this aspect of me that seems to observe all of that. So spirituality at its most fundamental level is this sense of I, the observer, at the very least. And then, of course, people develop it to varying degrees. And what we've, I guess coming from this as a mental health professional, what we've noticed is that this sense of I is this separate sense of I, independent sense of I, is really developing. It is much needed, really, and it can provide a much needed anchor whilst those changes are happening, because those changes are inevitable. And one thing in mental health is changes, even when it's wanted, it's probably one of the most common triggers for mental health problems. Whether it's an undiagnosable mental health condition and you're going through some basic anxiety or changes in mood, or whether you've got a full-blown relapse of a mental disorder or mental illness triggered, usually there's some change that has happened, desirable or undesirable. So developing and investing in this spiritual aspect of the self seems to provide a much needed anchor.
I think that chimes in really well with kind of how we also approach this idea of, you refer to it as like an inner observer, which is a nice way to frame it. The constant, that's there. So through life. And I think where we find this of real relevance in schools is this idea that you don't have to be dependent on these more superficial layers of identity, because there's a lot of stuff which imposes itself in terms of how we identify and what we identify with. And if we can get people thinking, young people thinking more, well, adults as well, but thinking about and rooting their sense of identity in something deeper, then as you say, as the change happens at the kind of surface level, it hopefully has less impact on me because I'm identifying at a deeper level. So that's the type of thing that you're referring to?
That's definitely what I'm referring to. And the powerful thing about this is that it actually doesn't belong to any religion or any religious institution. That sense of I actually only belongs to the individual.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's also universal. It's one thing that even brings all the religions together. That is something they would agree on.
Yeah. Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Okay. Okay. So then, there is this. Whilst we're on this point, there's sometimes a myth. Well, I suppose the question is it a myth? Because there's a balance between, okay, look, if you're having some kind of mental health issues, you just need to try harder, right? So there's this idea about you can get over it, and etc. And there's the balance between that stage and the stage of where you're trying to build resilience. So that, right, because young people growing up, you want them to come across stuff, right, that they are able to overcome, because that's the process of building resilience. And you want them to come across challenges and you want them to grow. But on the same, but it is a balance, because there's a point at which you also don't want them to come across such hurdles that are going to impact their mental health. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, or have it too easy, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the point, right?
We're the parental generation of saying yes too much and no too little.
And both can have their impact. And I'm trying to get a sense of, like, how would you speak to parents about how they might be able to navigate that balance?
Good question. Sometimes I actually find the body provides the best analogies for the mind. Mm-hmm. So this question of try harder. At what point do you try harder? At what point do you say, no, this is something we need to actually get help for? If you look at pain in the leg, right? You have pain. You could have it from a bruise. You could have it from a sprained ankle. Trying a bit harder is going to be helpful, isn't it? Because you need to, with a sprained ankle, make sure you do still engage in some gentle movement. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it'll get stiff. Mm-hmm. Try telling someone who's broken their leg, though, try harder. Mm-hmm. Try harder to run. Mm-hmm. Well, it's just going to make you worse. Mm-hmm. So in the same way with mental health and mental distress, there is a spectrum. And mental disorders and mental illness are really just normal, everyday human emotion and experiences which have now got to a point where the intensity and frequency and how long the duration of it is at a point now where it's becoming difficult for me to affect change in my life, almost impossible. It's becoming difficult for me to function on a basic level. And just much like with a broken leg, you can't walk, right? Yeah. So it then comes to a point where you then look at those things which treat the problem, but also support the symptoms. And you need that approach from both sides. So I think if you view mental health as a spectrum, and part of that is also understanding what good mental health actually looks like. Because a healthy person, somebody who has good mental health, actually feels a wide range of emotions. They're not just always smiling and feel nothing else. I mean, that's worrying. That's usually my patient who's in mania. So you feel the full spectrum of emotions, even the ones that may appear to be undesirable. Even society tells you it's undesirable. But what you understand is, okay, they happen. They're regulated, as in they come up at the time that they need to come up because they're trying to tell you something. Okay, so they're readable and they're appropriate to time and circumstance. When there's a disorder present, the feelings and emotions are unregulated. They don't always relate to the circumstance and situation. They're unpredictable. They're harder to manage. Does that make sense?
No, that's great. I mean, I really like the example of the broken leg and the pain. So if I have a broken leg, or I suspect I've got a broken leg, I go to the hospital, I get an x-ray done, and somebody confirms it for me, right? So like, it's hard to, well, not always hard, but I mean, it can be completely, it's obvious, but in terms of self-diagnosis, that's not so straightforward. But so and I like the idea of the spectrum and your point about the relationship between the symptom and the circumstance being an indicator. So I think that's a really helpful steer. In terms of the process of diagnosis and when you then actually do seek, because you could infer from what you said, you take it to a certain point before you then escalate. And is that the kind of idea that you
just
do
like
that?
You would with your broken leg, you take it to a certain point. If you just had a leg ache, you'd be, I probably slept funny, right? If you can't walk, you'd be like, I need to go and get this checked out.
And do you think that people in that condition are able to make that decision?
Most of the time, yes. There's very few conditions where you lose insight. Like
Okay.
with psychosis, you lose insight,
Right.
you know? But generally, if you're feeling sad or too anxious, you have insight.
Yeah.
What the problem usually isn't insight, it's stigma. So if there's a stigma against going to get help for a broken leg, people would walk around, just tolerate it. If you have a family who are like, just pull your socks up, who cares, get on with it,
Yeah.
you'll do that and you'll suffer,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
For longer.
Yeah.
And you'll take longer to heal.
Yeah.
So the thing is though, and this is, I don't want to get too much into this, but I do think this is an important point to make. In trying to reduce stigma with mental health, I think what we've ended up doing is turning things which are part of normal mental health, just normal psychological life problems, as mental disorders, you know, and also not educated ourselves properly about where to get help from in fear of getting a diagnosis. We thought, okay, let's just, so you wouldn't just go straight to a nurse or a physiotherapist if you thought there was a severe condition. You'd actually go and get a diagnosis. But again, the stigma influences people in that, okay, I'm comfortable having a mental health problem, I'll just go get therapy. The thing is, there's hundreds of types of therapies. There's also different types of medicines as well. And if you're misdiagnosed, you can try 5 different therapies. If they're not the right one for your condition, it's not going to improve. If you have a condition which also needs medicine, your improvement's going to be very slow. And mental health is just like physical health. The longer you leave a problem, the harder it is to treat.
So you we haven't even gone through half
I
the
know.
questions, but this is an important point. So in terms of navigating that, I mean, that's a hard thing to do. Like, it's hard for the person who's in the situation. It's hard for a parent who's not familiar with the healthcare system or medicine generally. So, because like you said, there are hundreds of different, and some of them go through the health service, and some of them are alternative and get advertised and whatever, right? So like, there's a whole bunch of things out there. Any kind of any framework or ways to think about that when somebody is either feeling something themselves, that they're feeling actually this is disproportionate to my circumstance, or a parent has some concern about a child?
Okay. First thing is, most people these days either go straight onto Google, okay, or they go to their mum's friend or some relative
Or a teacher.
right? And human beings are at base level caring, especially if you're a teacher or in the caring profession, and you want to help. Even if it's something which is outside of your remit, you will do your best to help. Again, people jump on digital media or their own personal experience. And the thing with digital media, again, just coming back to this point, who have you gone to? On digital media, on social media, there are reputable sources, and there are those who are trying to sell you things or just giving you information based on their experience. The hardest questions that come to me are often not the best questions, right, from my patients. They're often questions which have come up because they've been Googling things which are some obscure fact which has come out from someone's experience where they've put 2 and 2 together and made 8, you know? It's...
but when, you know, that kind of angle that people come in, you know, that sense of desperation that they need something different, and therefore by definition it's not mainstream, because, you know what I mean, it's coming from left field because it's a miracle cure.
No, that's not even what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in terms of even misinterpreting things like, for example, people will have a very black and white approach to, let's just take medication, right? I mean, I am a psychiatrist who is more likely to reduce and simplify your medication regime rather than add 5 more pills on your list. Okay, so I'm not saying I'm here as waving the flag for everybody should be on medication. I'm just not that type of psychiatrist. But there is a time and place for it. Where you get the timing right and you take it, it can be life-changing. And it doesn't, there's a myth. People think, oh, once you start it, it's addictive and you're on it for the rest of your life. Or even misconceptions like, okay, if you go to a therapist, there's less stigma to it and your disorder's less problematic because you can cure it with the talking therapy. What therapy you have or what treatment you have is no indication of how severe your disorder is. You know, so I would say that first port of call is go to somewhere reputable. So look at the NHS website, look at the Royal College of Psychiatrists website. You know, we've got hundreds of leaflets there, which actually they don't just tell you about disorders. They don't just tell you where to get help. They even give you questions that you can go and ask your GP or your psychiatrist or your psychologist. So you're actually asking the right questions.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's helpful. Thank you. So I've heard you speak previously about the 5 pillars. Just talk us through what you are talking about there.
So the 5 pillars, you're probably referring to the 5 pillars of spirituality,
Yeah.
and its impact on mental health. Yeah, so it's really born of actually looking more closely at the relationship between spirituality, spiritual identity, and spiritual practices, and their impact on prevention, or having more robustness with our mental health, as well as recovery from mental health problems when they do happen. And, since the 70s, right, especially in the Western world, spiritual practices from a wider reaching source of books and texts has become more prominent. So with that, more research has taken place. And I would say in the 70s and 80s, most of the research focused on whether these practices had an impact on how you feel, and what they work on. And they were quite generic. Whereas I would say from the 90s, especially since places like, organizations like the Royal College of Psychiatrists have taken more of an interest on the relationship between mental health and spirituality, the research has focused quite literally on what aspects of spirituality and spiritual practice and even religion have a supportive role in prevention and recovery. And so these 5 pillars are really, to just give it a bit more of a clinical context, they are born of those of you who do research, meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, because you can look at one obscure research and it could send you the entire other way. So meta-analysis kind of looks at them overall and takes the strongest and the best. And from that's emerged, I guess, the 5 strongest aspects of spirituality, and I say and/or religion, and because there is some overlap and what these 5 areas do to contribute to supporting our mental health and resilience and helping recovery, as well as prevention. So yeah, I mean, just in a nutshell, the 5, and this is, these 5 areas can be talked about at great length. So if we look at the first one, for example, which is not going to come as a surprise, it's positive psychology. Now, positive psychology is not something new. It's talked about now. Pop psychology talks about positive psychology, but it's been around for thousands of years because positive psychology is inherent to pretty much every spiritual tradition. You look at, pop psychology these days really promotes forgiveness, compassion, gratitude. And I guess this is the difference between spirituality and pop psychology is pop psychology stops at how it makes you feel.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas spirituality looks at further. Well, not only does it's great how it makes you feel, but what is the impact that has on your character, and your sense of identity, both the outward identity and the inner identity. So, really, when we're looking at it in terms of mental health and the studies of on spirituality and mental health, what's emerged is if you look at the roots of these positive psychological practices and attributes, we're moving beyond secular spirituality and moving beyond popular psychology. So it's really important that these
So when you say moving beyond secular spirituality,
so what I mean by this is you look at something like mindfulness, for example. Now, traditionally, mindfulness it's a spiritual practice. It's there in probably most of the Vedic traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism. It's there. Mindfulness is just being in the present moment. And then that serves as an anchor for whatever your next practice is going to be. But it is typically practiced alongside positive psychology, like compassion. Now, what we found, and Buddhists, as well as my colleagues who are Buddhists, will attest to this, is when you separate the spiritual, which is you make it secularized, you make it a very just practical practice, you lose something. You lose the impact that mindfulness has on that, what we talked about, that observer consciousness, right? And you
mean because it gets to a materialistic,
exactly, just on the physical body and
yeah.
just this mind.
Yeah,
That's
so
it.
there's nothing beyond.
Exactly, there's nothing beyond it. So positive psychology, but from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's the first pillar. And these pillars aren't in order of importance. They're just the way I'm speaking about them. The second one, again, is not going to be a surprise. The practices, meditation, yoga, prayer, they've been, whether that's a prayer that somebody's come up with themselves or whether that's prayer which is inherent to a particular religion. These have been, studied to death, quite literally, to the point where you just can't argue the impact they have physiologically, psychologically.
And would you mind somebody arguing that, well, even if it's a placebo, that's okay?
The thing is, okay, this word placebo gets thrown around so much. Placebo, generally, if you look at studies, most good studies will compare to nothing.
Yeah.
Okay, and placebo effect lasts 2 weeks at most, usually.
Yeah.
Right. That's when you know that other things are working, when they outlast the placebo effect. Placebo doesn't last forever.
Yeah.
Right.
No, but okay. So in terms of the actual, from a secular perspective, because this is the slight challenge that we'll get about the role of spirituality, what to speak of religion, in what is supposed to be a secular context like the health system, and the majority of education, and the potential of imposing a religious view. What to speak of doing that to people who may be vulnerable, and the sense of potential exploitation in that regard. So that's what I mean by the bit around the placebo, because that, in one sense, just crudely, whether God exists or not, if it works, if prayer works, why not do it? So from that perspective, I think it's like how do you I want you to carry on with the other three, but if you can just also speak to like how does that fit with how you're thinking about it in terms of, because you must come across this, this kind of don't bring the G word into this conversation kind of thing, like so how do you navigate that?
I think that's a good question. It's a really important question. Proving or evidence that prayer has a positive impact on our physical well-being, on our psychological well-being, doesn't mean it should be imposed on anyone.
Yeah.
Neither should God. Just like even having research prove that a particular antidepressant works for depression doesn't mean you impose it on anyone. Right? If somebody doesn't want it, you don't give it to them. But your conversation should allow for it to be an option.
So your point is that it works.
Yeah.
Whether you want to avail of it or not, that's your conversation.
That's up to you, exactly. It's shown to work.
Yeah.
Especially for those who want to do it,
Yeah.
And, even if you look at it on a relational level, if you look at prayer as, what many people who say prayer helps them, many of my patients have said is that prayer is you're revealing your mind in confidence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what therapy is. You're revealing your mind in confidence. That's what a good relationship is, someone to reveal your mind in confidence to.
Yeah.
So in one sense, what case studies of thousands of years show and human experience shows is also now shown in the laboratories.
Yeah. You say, I see where you're, these traditions that have been existing for millennia have inherently within them aspects which are supportive of mental health.
Absolutely.
And you can't get away from that in terms of now the academic studies that support that point. So okay.
So so that's that was the practices. And third thing, probably less talked about, is sacred architecture. And this was, I've been kind of working with this stuff now for at least 15 years since I've incorporated it into my own practice. Sacred architecture holds a lot more importance than people realize. You see, a lot of our healing takes place based on what we see, what we hear, even the food that we eat. And although there is a big push to secularize spirituality, and not always to get rid of God or a relationship with a higher power, often to make it more accessible, right? Because a lot of people have lost trust in, when they think of religion, they think of an institution, and institutions are run by people, and people make mistakes, right? So, but there is something about the architecture and the visuals and the sounds and I guess the atmosphere that's created by collective consciousness,
aesthetic,
and but also the atmosphere, right?
Yeah.
So again, that's something that's really been shown to be very supportive of people's mental health. Having a space which is dedicated to finding that
Interesting.
observer within you.
That's
right?
really interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like you walk into this establishment, even if you don't feel like studying, you get into that zone. I know when I go to a broadcasting house, because it's a hub of creativity, it doesn't matter what I was thinking about before. When I walk in there, my mindset just changes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So you're talking about here two things. One is the aesthetic and the other is the collective consciousness that's kind of gone into that building,
Absolutely.
that space. Yeah.
Absolutely. The fourth, again, something I think that's probably not spoken about, because I think people assume this is not something that is researched, but it is researched, is having a like-minded community around you. And now I think this is where I guess we speak a little bit more about the difference between spirituality, which is practiced independently, not anchored in a particular perhaps theology, or even with a particular group, is that actually some evidence does show that those who practice generic spirituality may actually be more vulnerable to mental health problems, where they lack a community because they're left with existential questions and nobody to support them with.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there was a study that I remember that, because I remember it really well because it struck me as, on one side, very surprising, and the other side, actually, when I thought about it, it was quite intuitive. So meditation, people who meditate can be more selfish.
Yeah.
Because what they were uncovering in this process was it was all about the self. It was still just about the self. And it didn't translate into engagement externally. So obviously there's different types of meditation, all the rest of it, but this was looking at particularly. So you're right. Some of these things can be double-edged swords, like in terms of how we approach them and see them in the context of a wider picture. Because if we ignore the context, there is a danger of getting a result that you're not expecting.
Exactly. And that's the problem with removing the why. Secularizing something, if it means making it more accessible, I'm all for it. But if you completely dislocate it from the why, then again, like with gratitude, people can be grateful for quite selfish reasons. I want to feel good, so I'm going to keep my gratitude journal. There's also, if you look at deeper aspects of gratitude, there's also a recognition of wow, this is more than I deserve. Not in I'm a doormat, low self-esteem kind of way, but valuing what you've been given. And that doesn't always lead to a high. That leads to a moment of reflection, and maybe a quietening, quiet appreciation. So, which isn't woohoo, like, yay, I'm grateful and I'm on top of the world. You know what I mean? And then the last but not least, which does involve the dirty word God, is that this whole idea of locus of control. Now, one thing with mental health or any change and improvement you want to make in life is that your locus of control has a big factor. Where does the power lie? Right? And one of the reasons I think higher power or God has become a dirty word is because people think about, I lose my control. Now, what the research shows is actually a collaborative relationship with a higher power or God actually keeps that locus of control with us. Okay. And so it's empowering. Whereas when there's awe or fear, that locus of control, with fear, that locus of control is very much on the other side. That everything's about punishment or loss and gain, right? Which can lead to, again, existential questions. It gives you a different light in which to view your life. It's not empowering, it's fearful, right? It's
And I think the other end of that spectrum, which is why the collaborative approach makes so much sense, the other end of that spectrum is equally damaging. So if young people, anyone has a belief that I'm in control of every single thing, then all of a sudden, that's a huge burden to carry.
Absolutely.
Something happens that you're not expecting or you don't want, and all of a sudden, I'm supposed to control that situation. So if we're not enabling ourselves and others to think about it from the perspective of, look, there are some things which I am not in control of. I cannot control every circumstance, because I feel that that's also something which presses down, especially on young minds. But it's unfair in terms of a worldview that somebody might grow with, this idea of this completely unrealistic expectation that they could possibly be expected to control a situation that they have no control over. So, like you said, there's two ends of this spectrum. One is no control, and the other one is absolute control. And none of those work. There has to be some form of mediation of those two extremes.
Yeah, collaboration. So that's that fifth pillar, right? A collaborative approach to your relationship with the higher power, God, or, whatever name or description you give that, it really has a powerful impact on prevention and recovery.
I mean, I just want to support this point from what we see in the world in terms of, I was reading up a bit about, you'll all know that the organization Alcoholics Anonymous. So Alcoholics Anonymous, and now it's widened in terms of the 12-step program that they've created, and it's widened to all forms of addiction. And what was incredible when I was reading through that is this focus on God. So they're very explicit. They're not shy about it. And it is arguably the most successful program in terms of the 12-step program, in terms of changing addictive patterns of behavior. And that's just undeniable in the sense of its impact and effect. And I think it's easily lost when somebody wants to make the argument that, well, keep God out of this. That's an easy kind of an objection to make. But the question really is, well, what's your alternative? I mean, what is the alternative? If you can't replicate the success of the 12-step program, what exactly are you doing here? You're taking away the foundation of something that's been proven to be so successful, but replacing it with precisely nothing. And therefore, how is that contributing to anything really, in terms of especially the types of behaviors that we're trying to change? So I think that's an absolutely kind of legitimate claim to make in terms of its efficacy, whether you believe it or not.
But I mean, it even if you look at it, if you just separate it from spirituality for a moment, just this whole collaborative approach in everything, it's a sign of maturity. Even if you look at human relationships, in the most immature human relationships, and this is not age specific, and I think this is also one of the reasons that we have problems in any institution or group, is when we have this black and white approach to the locus of control, that either it's my fault or somebody else's fault. I don't think there's any situation which is only one person's fault. There may be varying degrees. It may even be 98% and 2%. There's still 2%, which might be, okay, I can influence 2%, and that can be very empowering. It's when it's 0 and 100, you're either scared or you lack responsibility.
And just, I completely know the intent with which you're saying that, but just for clarity in terms of how somebody may misconceive that, especially when you're talking about young people who've gone through trauma or something significant, that in terms of the blame that they may take upon themselves as having a role in that situation. So how do you mitigate against that danger?
I mean, this is the thing. If you're specifically talking about all kinds of abuse, whether it's psychological, physical, sexual, whatever, financial, generally the abuser is usually, the part of the abusive psychology is that they move the locus of control to the
it's a
victim.
Blame,
it's a blame thing. So it's not, this isn't even about belief. It's like your own trust in yourself gets overridden by somebody telling you everything is your fault, which is why help is so important, because that has to be corrected, right? But even if the 1% locus of control is, I need to get help, that's still some locus of control. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, No, good. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next one just because I'm conscious of time. So we want to make sure that we've got enough time for the audience to ask questions. So here's coming in from a slightly different perspective. If we don't go down the route of spirituality, if we don't use that as the 5 pillars kind of speak to the role of spiritual, something other that can help here. If we don't go down that route, tell us a bit about what other, we all know about the kind of prescription drug kind of solutions to this, but some of the other potential solutions to this.
I mean, if the thing is, I opened with saying that we've kept ourselves really busy, either busy being distracted or busy trying to maintain a particular identity or lifestyle to feed that identity. I think it's time that on every level, before you even get to the spiritual, actually, because it's very hard. If you look at spirituality, it's at a certain level of self-actualization, right? The best I can be. But our fundamental needs have to be met, you know? And okay, food, water, shelter, those things, feeling protected and safe, those things are important, but relationships are also important, you know? And it's funny because we live in a world where we're not actually lacking, right? And yet we struggle with basic things like sleep, with nutrition, with quality of nutrition. You know, someone was telling me the other day that our soil has become so depleted of nutrients. One apple in the 1950s, you'd have to get that same level of nourishment, you'd have to eat 5 of today's apples, you know? So in terms of prevention of mental health problems doesn't have to start with, you know, big complicated ideas.
Yeah. Okay.
It can just start with, okay, do I have enough space in my life just to look after myself? You know, before I go and then start looking after everybody else. Because, you know, even on a plane, when the plane's crashing, what do they say? Parents, put your oxygen mask on first before you give it to your child, right? So whatever roles or responsibilities we have in the world, if we're not taking care of ourselves, then however much we invest in other people, whatever forces we are empowered by, we're not going to be able to channel them as well if we're not functioning well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think prevention has to start at home, even for young people.
Yeah.
And parents set the example. We teach our kids how to manage when there's change, how to manage when there's stress. You know, typically, you were talking about self-harm before. Why has self-harm become so prevalent? Yes, there's the side that children are more distressed, young people are more distressed. They're being exposed to far too much, far too quickly. But there's also exposure and acceptability. And where dealing with stress, it's acceptable to self-harm, you don't put a thought behind doing it, right? So if you grow up in a home, in a household where there's no thought behind reacting a particular way or hurting yourself or taking to drugs or alcohol, just binge watching TV, or do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
As a solution, then that's what children will grow up with. Similar in schools.
Yeah.
You know, we bring our person to our job, right?
Yeah.
So that, I think the prevention, I think looking at it as a simplifying it a little bit, that it doesn't always have to be a professional, there's a lot we can do. The other thing is recognition. You know, I think with young people, far too often, too much gets piled in with, oh, it's just teenage angst. You know, yes, hormones do contribute to emotional dysregulation. I think that's one of the things that probably parents and teachers find challenging about a certain stage of childhood and teenage years is when another person's emotions are dysregulated, unless ours are regulated, we get caught up in their dysregulation, and it makes anything you do, whether it's parenting or teaching, difficult.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think recognition of there's emotional dysregulation that comes naturally, because going from childhood to teenage is a big change. But then there's something beyond emotional dysregulation, which, you know, okay, this is beyond just normal teenager, and actually let me just get help and support, or don't let it get to that point. You know. I think that there's a lot that can be said in this regard in terms of other avenues, and we can go down the whole, it needs more money, it needs more investment, but generally where we need more money and investment, people often ask for it on the reactive side. Oh, we have this problem, let's react to it and put money into the solution to react to this problem. I do think we need to invest more time. Time is also a resource. You know, our society deserves a wealth of happiness, not just the wealth of money.
So let's take that as a cue into what maybe the last question before we open up. If you had some advice for the education minister around mental health in schools for young people, what would that be?
I would circle back to my very first point, which was 50% of adult mental health problems start by the time someone's 14, and they have to wait on average about 10 years to get help. You treat kids when they're 50, in their teenage years, without them waiting 10 years, you've solved 50% of adult mental health problems. That 50% of adult mental health problems, who, if we go with 1 in 4 develop some mental health problems, that reduces it to 1 in 8, right? Which frees up more adults to be healthier parents, healthier members of society. The cost to society isn't just a financial one. Okay, sure. It's not just a financial one. So I would say so the first thing is we're in schools. Schools are not meant to be mental health institutions. I'm not expecting schools to give equal resources to mental health, but at least some more than has been given, and the permission to do that. The permission, the space, and the opportunity. So if the education minister can kind of, I know there's pressure to react to immediate things, but also have a more longitudinal vision, informed by this, that the cost to society is more than money. It's about happiness and healthiness.
Yeah, and I think that's it's very appropriate. One of the things that we're focused on at Avanti is this idea of how do we influence the pastoral system in our schools and the curriculum, which better reflects character, personal development, and spiritual insight in a way that's impactful, but also is supported by, as I say, the pastoral system that takes them not just in a reactive way, which is the typical way pastoral systems work in schools, driven, of course, by a lack of resource, but essentially. But how can we? Because we must be able to this education being, or academic, if you say, the aspect of the academic development of the child being one part of the holistic development of the child, and how do we rebalance that in terms of the time, which is schools are always struggling for time in terms of what they can squeeze into the curriculum, the resource that goes into supporting that, because there's skill sets that's required, and so forth. So it is a real challenge, but I do feel that there are potential openings that we can do. And from the few things that we've started to do over the years, we're starting to see how that's already yielding some fruit in terms of the benefits.
I mean, material resources are limited. There's a finite amount. Even if there's more than enough on the planet, the distribution is uneven. It just always will be. As long as the human side is imperfect, so will the distribution be. But we have to work with what we have. There always has to be a reactive element, but also thinking of preventive. Both need to go in parallel. And while we're making the transition, getting better at prevention whilst dealing with the reactive, there will be some austerity somewhere. That's inevitable. But spiritual resources are infinite. And they belong to each and every individual. And I think this is one area where I think every system could do better in terms of making people realize and giving them space to understand, and especially the growing child, that they're not just valued for their roles, how much they earn, what position they have, but their value is, what they're valued for is beyond what just the world sees.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are now going to open up to questions, and I'm going to hand over to Raj to coordinate that.
Thank you very much for that really insightful session. I just had a question that I feel when I look at my children, I feel that the amount of work that they're getting in school, I can't even relate to it because I didn't do that much work when I was younger. But they get so much. And because of that, I feel that quite often I'm seeing more frustration, more anger coming out. I just feel that there's a lot of pressure at a very young age. And I was just wondering if you've seen any evidence of anything that parents seem to do that helps to deal with that, especially with the children.
This may sound simple, but spending time with children, that it's what's difficult for parents and adults and children both to do in terms of getting off the work, whether that work is on a screen or on a piece of paper, is there isn't an alternative activity, right? During the COVID pandemic, the 2 years that people were working from home primarily, they became more exhausted, even though working from home was desirable before COVID, right? Everybody was begging to have a day working from home and everybody would get shut down, and then COVID comes along, everybody's allowed to do it. The problem is they would segue straight from their online time to work into their entertainment time. And then so that encroached on their personal time. Those who did well were people literally built-in time outside of their work or education time to leave their screen, to leave their activity and go do something else. The fact of the matter is when we live together, we almost become oblivious to what other people are doing. It's like they become part of the furniture. So it takes that much more effort to structure in time together, because even though you're together all the time, right? Think about any relationship. When you're living in separate spaces, by the time you come together, you put more effort into what you do in the time you have together. You're more attentive. When we start living together, again, friends, family, and even when you're at school together in the same classroom all the time, you start to become part of each other's furniture, and you become less attentive and invest less in the time you have together because you think it's available at all times. So as parents, a really simple thing to do is make use of the time you already have together by putting in conscious activities, which give you a break, give the kids a break, and actually improve your relationship, which has a knock-on effect on your emotional regulation because you're not carrying anything just on your own. Yeah? Is that might not be the answer you were looking for.
The onus is back on you. I mean, it's one of the things that kind of, we have a spectrum, right? So like we have some parents who come to us and say, "You're not giving my child enough homework," and we have to kind of say to them, "Calm down. It's okay. They'll be okay. They're 4 years old. Leave them alone." And the other end of the spectrum, which is, it's too much. But I think one of the things that, it's similar, but just a kind of slight nuance to the point that Chetna made is that I always encourage parents to spend as much time as possible having the conversation with their child. And for some reason or another, conversation actually that goes beyond what did you do at school today, an actual deeper level conversation just seems to be so rare. And it's not just the kids who are on their devices. I mean, the parents are as if not worse in terms of the amount of screen time parents want to keep imposing on their children. Maybe they should impose it on themselves in terms of making, the child is there. And we talk about kind of the pressures of, modern day life. The child is there in front of us, at dinner time or whenever that might be. And the parent is on a screen. And so I think the quality of conversation that takes place between parents and children, I find is concerning, actually. And I think that there's nowhere near enough emphasis placed as could be at home on the quality of the conversation that takes place between parents and children. And I think just that one thing would not only massively improve their life chances in terms of how they do at school and in all aspects of their life, but also improve the relationship at home. So
can I make one point on that, just building on that? Being a parent is automatic for some people. Well, for a lot of people, right? You just become a parent. But being a good parent is hard work. And actually, being a good parent requires a level of selflessness, because good parents have to evolve their parenting style with the changing needs of their child. So the conversation is different. I mean, prior to 11, your kids dote on you. So however you want to take the conversation is interesting to them, right? So conversation might be easier. Different parents are going to have different experiences. I appreciate that. Some people find the teenage years easier. But as that subtle umbilical cord gets cut when they develop their own identity, what they want to talk about, what they want to do may not be of interest to us as parents. It may even put fear in you because maybe you never were exposed to what they're interested in or don't understand it. And so this is where I guess that being a little selfless, engaging in the austerity of, okay, if I can let go of what I've gotten used to, which is actually have control over their every movement and give them a bit of freedom, the ability to fly like a kite while there's this cord connecting them to me, that will actually improve even and ensure that they have good relationships as adults. Because generally when children and young people can open up about what's interesting to them with someone who may not even find it interesting, like their parents, and they know you'll still listen to them and give them space, then when it comes to talking about the difficult stuff, that difficult stuff is not so hard to share.
We as parents are expecting too much from our children, and the societal pressures are such that we feel that we have to go by what society is asking us to do. And we are not being helpful to our own selves, and we are not being content. Satisfaction and content are two words which I feel expect a lot out of us. We are not happy with what we have. And so we demand too much from everybody, including ourselves. And the pressures in the society and the education system and the world outside the education system, in the sense that the pressure of going to work and the management is expecting out of you, and all the markets are expecting out of you, are so much that is beyond our control. So where satisfaction and contentment lie are, I feel, to the two main pillars which we should be, adapting ourselves to. That's the way I see it. I don't know how you feel about it, but that's the way I feel, that the pressures have to go down, and we have to be content with less than having more.
I think that's a really powerful point, and I couldn't agree with you more. But it does, where we put the boundary of what's enough, or how we respond to other people's expectations, also depends on who we hear from, right? You hear from and surround yourself with people who are on board with a simple lifestyle and live by what you need, then creating that boundary for yourself is much easier. But if we surround ourselves with and keep hearing that more, then even if you want to have a boundary of simplicity, it's going to be very hard to put in place. And then when our supplies are exhausted, then children very easily become extensions of our own egos, right? And we try to live through them. So yeah, I think that's a powerful point. Thank you so much.
Thank you for a wonderful session today. I just wanted to take a step back. I want some insightfuls, like how would you recognize actually if a person is suffering? For example, Mr. Gor said that you do have pastoral cares for the children, but what about the adults? You see your friend is suffering, you see that they are becoming exclusive, not engaging, but how would you help, or how would you even recognize the fact that they need help? In America, apparently, I was speaking to my cousin, 1 in 3, the statistics which Mr. Go said, it is alarmingly very high in America, and they give something called there is something called mental first aid course. It is still a taboo in UK, and forget about India. They are still considered as, the moment you approach someone and start revealing yourself, they will immediately say, ye to pagal hai. That is the common. But how would you recognize? Can you please throw some insights? Because we do see around ourselves many people who are working. You see that this person has changed a lot and this person needs help. How would you even broach that subject that you need help? Can you please throw, because it is quite a sensitive topic. That's why I think people resort to go on Googling, because there is societal apprehensions, it's still a taboo. Stigma. And there are many categories, as I understand. It is not one particular issue. There are so many categories under it.
One of the reasons there's less stigma with physical health is it's very easy for us to see ourselves as not the body. I have a body, but I'm not just this body. It's just part. That's easy, right? You don't have to be deeply philosophical to accept that. There's no stigma with a broken leg or a broken arm, or even with cancer. In one sense, like if somebody has cancer, they will get help and they will even talk about it. There's this program, it was on years ago, called Embarrassing Bodies. People would go on TV showing all their weird lumps and bumps. There was no stigma. It was almost like voyeurism, like, hey, look at me kind of thing. But with mental health, why? Because having that sense of who am I separate from the mind and body, when we don't have that, or it's not nourished, then our next place to have our locus of who am I is our character, our personality, how we feel. And so I come across this commonly. The reason people have waited a long time to get help is because they don't want to be judged on being seen as weak for having mental health problems. But mental illness is not a sign of weakness of an individual. You wouldn't say someone's weak just because they've broken their leg. It's a bone. It's vulnerable to breaking if it's twisted the wrong way. Yes, the mind is more than the brain, but there is definitely a biological and psychological aspect of the mind which respond to changes in our circumstances, in our brain. They respond to certain genetics. And so on the one hand, I want to the reason I'm saying this is to help anybody in this room who's experiencing that stigma, that shame, that, or maybe this is a weakness of character in me. Now, recognizing it, if someone's distressed and you see that they're struggling, the onus doesn't have to be on us to diagnose. Right? Even just acknowledging, I've noticed that, you seem distressed. Is there anything you want to talk about? We put pressure on ourselves that we've got to solve it for them and even get the solution, right? Because we often find other people's distress hard to manage because we find our own distress hard to manage, right? And also there's compassion there. So just acknowledging for someone, because this sentence, I think you need help. Somebody comes to you saying you need help. Immediately you're saying to the person, something's wrong with you. Right, you need help. It doesn't feel good to us. So you seem distressed. You don't seem like you. Do you want to talk about it? I think just having that conversation, and there's a power to the conversations we have, because the intention and conversations we have this human wireless network. It attracts help. It sets a path for each of us. People easily talk about it very openly when it comes to coaching and finding your purpose, that you set your intention in a particular way and you'll go there. Doors will open up. Same thing happens in our relationships. We set a particular intention with what we're communicating, doors will open up. You don't have to become an expert in mental health. If you saw that your friend was distressed and you felt the distress was coming from physical pain, they may even be shy to share. But if you just even express your observation and don't get too caught up in if they get help or when they get help. See, when it comes to trying to love other people, if we really want to love them, we have to sometimes let go of our expectation to how they respond to our love. And I know that's quite deep and maybe outside of direct mental health, but I've found it very useful. It hurts, but it's useful. Is that okay?
Hi. I was reflecting on the point you made earlier, the both of you, about communication with children, and also just the normal changes you might see as your kids get into teenage years, and just sort of normal behaviour. And I actually have the opposite concern, because sometimes I find myself over-communicating. I've got an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old, particularly with the 8-year-old, due to concerns about mental health, and actually just ensuring that they don't grow up with any trauma and things that they have to fix later on. And I think that's quite overwhelming as a parent, because I don't want to take his childhood away from him because I'm constantly talking about, how was school? Are you okay? Who did you talk to? What kind of, and I think sometimes it probably can get overwhelming for him. He's never suggested it has, but I think in the long term it might. What do you have any suggestions as to how to really just strike that balance and not take away that sort of innocence and that childhood from them?
I think you're already beginning to do it anyway, just by recognizing that sometimes your questioning is driven by fear and concern. There's a difference between fear and concern. Concern is important, right? We want to get the balance right between exposure and protection. Right? You look at a vaccine, it's exposure to a degree where you end up having protection, isn't it? So life provides experiences for our kids which can serve as a vaccine. So be there for, as they get older, they get better at knowing when they need us. What can happen is if we're overly concerned, then when there is a problem, they may be scared to come to us because it's so overwhelming, because they also have to then carry our fear. So doing a little bit of self-work on your own fear. Where do your own fears come from? What's the worst case scenario? And not being so scared of trauma. Trauma's not always bad. Not everybody gets PTSD after a perceived traumatic event. I have patients with PTSD after really quite simple incidents which were not traumatic, like a hospital stay. They get traumatized by the lights or not sleeping properly, because there's so many things that go around any mental disorder. It's not black and white. And then there's others who, they have a life where they are facing real challenges every day, just either because of their work or just their circumstances. Somehow they just don't get PTSD. It doesn't traumatize them. So don't be so scared of trauma. Yeah, it's not always traumatic. Trauma isn't always traumatic.
Can I ask a follow-up question? The same sort of question around spiritual life. So how much you're engaging them in spiritual life and getting that balance between sort of, I suppose, just not overwhelming them, but making sure that you've given them those tools for them to then carry on, in their journey, I guess.
I mean, when they're younger, they're going to follow suit. But everybody comes to a point, and we've all been through it, where whatever you do, you have to do because you want to. So letting them know that, especially as they get older, it is their choice. But that doesn't mean you withdraw completely. You're there as a friend. And actually, the best way is to set an example, right? Kids come back to what their parents do. Generally, we do that. But I'm sure every person in this room has got habits, both good and bad, that you picked up from your parents. Right?
Scary as that may seem,
Yes.
yeah.
Hi, thank you for the session. I just want to say, a lot of children learn from life experiences. So as a school, is it not a good idea to take children to a homeless place or an orphanage, and that way they may realize they've really got a lot going for them. They may appreciate the simpler things in life. I know a friend who took her family to India, and they went to like a poor place, a slum, and their life just changed. They came home, Mom, I don't want this, I don't want that. And I think a lot of that comes from school. If the education minister and that can change the curriculum and have sessions like this where a school is allowed to visit a slum or something life-changing. And I think that will affect people mentally, because, when you do something good, it will, affect you.
Yeah.
And like my son's friend went to India, he said the smell is horrible, this is horrible. When they're exposed, they're not wearing the right trainers. So we're so used to materialistic things. And when you have this life-changing experience, even visiting a soup kitchen in London or the homelessness, I think these sort of things need to be brought more into the school atmosphere. It will have, I'm telling you, a life-changing experience.
No, I think it's a great point. I remember in my primary school, going to an old people's home and doing stuff for them. And I think those experiences are genuinely very valuable, I think, whatever they may be. So we do that through different ways. And there are different pressures here. So just to kind of education and the education sector has moved on since I was at primary school, some in good ways, some in not so good ways. And I think there has been, over some period of time, a narrowing of the curriculum in terms of what that extracurricular exposure looks like. Some of that's driven by resources. For example, these things cost money and et cetera, and what that applies. Some of them caused by other considerations about what students should or should not be exposed to, but others around also just in terms of at what age these different things happen. So for us, a lot of our emphasis, particularly at secondary level, has been around the students taking part in their own chosen charity or activities that they've engaged. I mean, to give you a really good example, at this school that we're in right now, during lockdown, it was the sixth formers and GCSE students who were making meals every day, hundreds and thousands even, in terms of both creating the meal, distributing it, letting people know in the community know about it. So those types of activities that they are, and I find, to Chetna's point around the point around where does the initiative of that come from is almost as important as what it is that they're doing. And I think that prompt and that coming from them has, something changes and they grow into the person that they want to be through those experiences. So yeah, no, look, I do fully agree, but there's a real, I of clearly am involved in discussions about what goes into the timetable. And as you can imagine, every time you have a conversation about what goes into the timetable, you have to have a conversation about what goes out of the timetable. So, and so what goes in is real easy. I can give you a list of 100 things that should go into the timetable. But it's a tough one. But that's not taking away from your point. I fully appreciate that. And one of the other things which we found more recently has been extremely impactful is that a sister charity of ours called Avanti Foundation has a retreat center in Lincoln. And we've been doing school trips to that place. And some of those residential trips, I mean, I've been there sometimes when the kids have been there. They have been absolutely transformative. And some of the most transformative experiences, not just the usual kind of archery and raft building and all of that stuff they do, but what the additional piece that they have been doing, and which has been quite mind-blowing actually, I think, in terms of where we go with this into the education system, is about the conversations that we have and facilitate between students for them to talk about stuff that those conversations, they just don't happen. So they're surprised at themselves engaging in a conversation, which for some reason, society, circumstance, home life, whatever it might be, has just not allowed to happen. And many of those kids have gone back to their schools and said, why don't we do this every week? So that's a conversation we're having with our school principals right now, saying the kids want to do this for some time every week. What needs to come out of the curriculum to be able to enable it to happen, right? So it's a tough one, but yeah, we have to get to a space where there is a more holistic attention to the whole child.
If you did a survey, trip to Rome versus homeless shelter, what are the kids going to pick?
Yeah. That the parents might pick homeless shelter. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, and thanks for that. It was really a really interesting discussion. I just wanted to sort of refer back to some of those stats that you quoted from the beginning, because they were really quite stark, actually, and I'd not come across those numbers before. So I'm assuming these are based on figures from the UK or just from the West generally?
Okay, so most of those stats were from the NHS for the UK. There was one stat from the World Health Organization, which was a global stat about the suicide rate between 15 to 29-year-olds, fourth highest cause of death for that age group. But the rest of them for UK.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in my own mind, when you look at societal change, because you focus very much, I guess, on social media and the impact, we've all seen that, all of us who've got kids have seen that, and also mental health. But I guess if you look at sort of the West in particular, particularly Western liberalism, it's a great thing, it's great for innovation, for creativity, but it's very much a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because it's now cutting through. I was born in 1968, so I'm a child of the 60s, I can say. But the world in which I was born into, and when I compare it to my children now, of 14 and 15, is completely different. So some of those old certainties have been stripped away and have been replaced by what? And I think it's almost like a maelstrom, isn't it? So I think where we're seeing this, there's a relationship here, I think, between that and the changes in mental health and all these other things. I think there's a relationship there. So it'd be interesting to see if there was some studies going on looking into that.
That's a comment or a question?
Well, it was just a thought, just from what you've been saying. I guess it's an observation, really, rather than a comment. But I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are.
I mean, my thoughts on it are just come back to this point of our kids are exposed to too much too soon. I think our exposure was more measured in previous generations. But one thing I have seen is each generation finds its own solutions, because they understand their challenges best. So one thing I do see from having a teenage daughter is whilst the social media may be causing problems, there are also voices there who are, because young people are taking it in their own hands, like, okay, our parents don't understand this, they don't have a solution. This is a solution that I found, and it works for me. And funnily enough, a lot of it circles back to the kind of life we might have had in the 60s, 70s, 80s, which is more simple, more organic, more healthy, less time on the screens, more personal time, positive affirmations, more spirituality. I think my daughter's always telling me that, actually. it's more acceptable for her generation to be spiritual and talk about spirituality. So yeah, that problem of too much too soon, we have some control over it, but I have confidence that if we support them, the young people of today will also find the solutions for themselves and for the children that they have.
Hello. You know, the statistics you gave were quite shocking. I've never thought that this would be existing in a Western society, you know. When I look at it, you know, I've been to India several times in the last 2 years, and I think the kids here, maybe there's something, disconnection, that they've got everything. Like the lady said, that if they're made to realize that things that we take for granted here are not easily available to people living in slums, you know, when I just see at them and you just smile at them, they've got nothing. They still, you know, you can see the radiance. So do we think that we've given too much and then we're trained to expect too much again? And coming to schools, I think schools have got enough. There's certain things you can't do at schools because you're regulated by. I think as a parent, certain things they can take upon themselves. You know, like, you know, she said, taking your children to a place where they see an orphanage and they see how people are living. You know, we've got so much support here. The welfare system is there. The education system is there. Back in India, a lot of things don't even exist. So I think, yes, certain things the parents have to take upon themselves. You know, you can't expect the schools to do everything.
I mean, I think there's one point that occurs to me also about the previous point about where society was and where it's come to now. And I think one of the things that for me differentiates, like if you look at it from a societal level, so there's the piece around affluence and access to modern amenities and the pressures that has and what comes with that. Another perspective is the difference between a society that still values and has community at the center versus one that has moved to a very individualistic society. And that, you know, that movement from large kind of village or community or extended family, et cetera, life towards a shrinking of that circle towards nuclear families to the individual, and the way that the kind of underpinnings of society are going, I think that's also has a role to play in terms of the individuals, both their identity and how they relate to others, and where they source support from in their life. And I think I don't know of. I mean, you asked a question about studies. I don't know, or I can't cite at least any studies in that regard, but there seems to be something there. It feels to me that there is something there about the shift away from community to individual, which has some role to play in terms of how we think of ourselves and where we get support from, and the range of people. I mean, here's a maybe a helpful analogy. Sometimes parents feel that they can provide for the child entirely for all of their needs within the home. And that might be with regards to their education, or it might be with regards to their development. But one of the things that studies have found is that the spectrum of different personalities and types and roles in that child's life is beneficial for the holistic development of the child, because they're getting different sources of both inspiration, of challenge, of support, of, you know, education, things that they're learning from. So I think there is something about an isolated, and it could be a virtually isolated situation as opposed to necessarily a physical one. But it does feel like, and, you know, there's lots of stats on this about how people feel so lonely in a world that is supposedly so connected, right? You get this kind of thing thrown around on social media around how we're all living in such a lonely world. But in many respects, it's so true. And despite the fact that we have so much so-called connection.
Crowded loneliness.
Crowded loneliness, that's the term. Crowded loneliness. So yeah, I think there is something there, but Sorry, I can't quote the stats.
I mean, in a nutshell, what you're saying is it takes a village to raise a child. Right?
No, that's absolutely right. I really do think that there's something in that.
There's when I was a medical student, my elective, a part of it was in psychiatry in Delhi. And in a typical clinic, in a really busy clinic in the UK, I might see 15 patients in a day. When I was doing the clinic in Delhi, I was seeing 90 people in a day. The queue was literally right around the hospital. The patients didn't get more than a few minutes with me. My notes were literally a couple of sentences. But you know why it was okay? Because I knew they were going back to not just their family, but an extended family who would take care of them. Here, you need more time because you've got to think about all the different layers that the services have to provide that the community or family can no longer provide because the community or family has become smaller. So I just to echo what you're saying, that it's mirrored, not just in terms of young people, but it's actually mirrored in our health services.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, thanks for the talk. What's your views on happiness? Because I think I guess everybody's trying to reach a state of happiness in any sort of circumstance. So when I was at school, I think you might know Dr. Selfdiagnosis, which is happiness lessons at school level. But when you reach into a work environment, like how do you actually reach that inner state of happiness in whatever situation you're in?
I think we need to have a more holistic understanding of happiness. It's not just a feeling. It's an experience. It's a state of being. And the state of being of happiness includes in it many emotions and feelings. There's physical, but if you're thinking about it as an absence of distress, right, which is what most people connect it with, there's the absence of distress being a level of happiness, and then there's the actual connection with joy. They're two different things. And so there's an absence of distress and connection of joy, which you can have physically. There's also absence of distress psychologically and a connection with joy. There's also the spiritual aspect to it. And we are more likely to have those experiences wherever we place investment of time, education and practice, right? So your person who's focusing on their physical health, they are less likely to experience distress in the body and more likely to experience the joy of the body because it will feel strong and resilient. Same, we invest time in our psychological, mental well-being, our character. We're less likely to experience distress on that side. And even when that distress comes, it's a helpful communicative distress. And we're more likely to connect with the joy, psychological happiness. Similarly, that very inner happiness of the observer, invest time in development of the spiritual self, rather than being, spiritual distress means being disconnected from the spiritual self. Not only will we have an absence of the distress and we'll feel connected, but we're more likely to connect with the joy of being who we actually are. So, we're multifaceted beings, so all facets of a diamond need polishing.
But for now, can we give both Nitesh and Dr.